Hi, I'm Caroline Leavitt. I'm the co-founder of A Mighty Blaze, the book initiative that was begun right when the pandemic started to help independent bookstores, readers, and writers, of course. And today I'm really excited about today because we have both Pamela Erens and Robin Black, and we have this remarkable series of books called, let me see if I can get it in the camera, Bookmarked, which are authors talking about the books that really stuck with them through their lives and influenced.
Oh, I
We
think
lost,
have we lost
we
Caroline?
lost Caroline. Oh no.
Well, why don't we chat then and
We will chat.
fill it up. So I'll just say a little bit more about the series. She's back.
Caroline's
I'm back. I'm so sorry. It gave me an error message, but thank you so much for jumping in. I want to say that this series is amazing. Also, you should go to bookshop.org to order these books. There's Mrs. Dalloway, the Robin Black, and there is Middlemarch and the Imperfect Life by Pamela Erens. Or go to your favorite indie bookstore. If you have any questions, please pop them in the chat and we will ask them later. Okay, so Pamela Erens is the author of the novels The Virgins, 11 Hours, and Understory, as well as the middle grade novel Matasha, great name, and the hybrid memoir critical essay Middlemarch and the Imperfect Life. Her books have been finalists for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for First Fiction, the William Saroyan International Prize for Writing, and the John Gardner Fiction Book Award, and have appeared on many of the Best of the Year lists, including The New Yorker, NPR, The New Republic, and the usually Crankus Kirkus. She's also been named one of the 23 contemporary writers you should have read by now. Robin Black's story collection, If I Loved You, I Would Tell You This, was a finalist for the Frank O'Connor International Story Prize and a Best Book of the Year in multiple publications, including the Irish Times and San Francisco Chronicle. Her wonderful novel, Life Drawing, was longlisted for multiple awards and named a Best Book of the Year by NPR, among others. An essay collection, Crash Course, Essays from Where Writing and Life Collide, came out in 2016, followed now by this book, Mrs. Dalloway. I'm really honored to say that I know both of these women and they're friends, and I just love their books. So the first question I'm going to ask them, and then I'm going to vanish and let them talk for a half an hour before I come back to ask my questions. We have two books called Bookmarks, where authors talk about the books that meant the most to them and why. Tell us about this series. I'm going to disappear now.
So the series is started several years ago. Authors were asked to write about a book that they found formative in their lives. And in the beginning, there were a lot of men writing about books by men. And at one point, I got to know the publisher, and I was sort of ribbing him that we're you need some women. You need some women writing about books about women, or women writing about books not about women, but you need some women authors in the series for sure. And Robert took me up on that, and I chose to write about Middlemarch. And there was no question that was going to be the book I wanted to do. I first read it when I was 20, and it just blew my mind. I was brought to it by a friend and roommate during college, and I just sunk into it and couldn't get over it. It seemed so capacious. It seemed to talk about the whole world, a whole community of people, and it had such a largeness of vision and a generosity and a wit. I loved the narrator of it and her godlike view. So I always knew I was going to do that book. And that's what I did. Robin, how did you end up picking Mrs. Dalloway?
You know, it's funny because I learned about the series from Curtis Smith, who did a really good one early on. And I immediately knew that if I were ever to do it, it would be Mrs. Dalloway. And I thought about it. And then when Pamela told me that she was doing Middlemarch, I had this moment of thinking, wait a minute, if she'd said Mrs. Dalloway, I would be so envious. And it's a little harder for me to explain why Mrs. Dalloway. I've thought about this a lot since I began the project, and people asked me that question. And in a way, I think I've decided that I had a crush on the book, that I can't say like, I love this about it, I love that about it. I just sort of, it's like if the book had been a student in a classroom with me, I would have been sneaking glances at it all the time because I was just so intrigued by what Woolf had done. And I didn't read the book until I was over 40, which is more or less the time I started writing seriously. And at that time in my life, the issues the book deals with having to do with mental health issues and also with women who are so strongly identified with a domestic setting, who are, really, they are their homes in some sense, and or at least feel that to be the role in which they've been cast. All those things resonated really strongly for me. And something I've struggled with a bit, but I'm curious, Pamela, how you have, is taking on an iconic book.
Right. I have to say first, Robin, before, I think we've talked about this. If I hadn't done Middlemarch, I would have done Mrs. Dalloway or To the Lighthouse. Those were sort of the two and number 2 and 3. So it was good you jumped in and grabbed it. There was some fear involved in taking on Middlemarch. In particular, there's a wonderful book, 2014 book by the New Yorker reporter Rebecca Mead, and she wrote My Life in Middlemarch in that year. And I was so mad when that book came out initially because I thought she did the book I wanted to do, that I was thinking of doing. I read it and loved it and appreciated it. And I thought, well, that's it. I'm never going to write my Middlemarch book. When this opportunity came up, I did think about Mead's book a lot and how mine would be differentiated from it. And I just decided, on some level that I have my own special relationship to the book. And that's what I could write about. Rebecca's Rebecca, I'm me. And it played a particular role in my life that I could talk about. I was nervous that somehow I would end up finding out I had only, in fact, 2 original, bits of relationship to it. But once I got into it, I found that there was plenty that I had to say about its role in my life. And I did read a lot of critical work, but I just tried not to be intimidated by it. And I remember we had that conversation, Robin, when we were working on it, were we or were we not going to read critical material on the books? And I think you decided not to.
Yeah,
I'd like to hear about that decision and how you felt about just the millions of words that have been written about Mrs. Dalloway over the decades.
Somebody I read in a comment on a Facebook thread today, and I thought this person actually put it very well. They said that to them, Mrs. Dalloway is sacred text adjacent. And I think there are a lot of people who feel that way. I mean, I think this was, whether I hadn't phrased it exactly that way, but it was a problem I really grappled with, up until now, which is people are obsessed with this book. I mean, when I announced on Facebook, I'm doing this book on Mrs. Dalloway, the number of people who said, it's my favorite book, it's my favorite book. And I just felt that what I wanted to focus on in my book was really one individual's relationship to this text and not so much how I was responding to the endless amounts of really good literary criticism, psychological criticism that's out there. So I didn't look at any. I tried really hard not to, and to focus just on what the one reader's experience of this book is. And I think that that's partly why that theme is really strong in my book, is that every book is different for every reader. And I was thinking about that when you were talking about Rebecca Mead's book, which I've read both of yours, and they both need to be in the world. But that I was thinking about this notion, can you be preempted on a book? Or isn't it true that every book is being different for every reader? Really, every reader has a book about a book or a conversation or a thought. And so, first of all, you were not preempted, but I'm not sure anybody really can be.
Yeah, I have to believe that too. I mean, the great books, the Mrs. Dalloways, the Middlemarches, Jane Austen, Charlotte Bronte, whoever, there's just they're endlessly fertile and they're endlessly renewed by readers. I mean, we're still reading these books that are 50, 100, 150, 200 years old. So I feel there's a place for an endless number of responses to those books. And that makes me happy. I want to see more of them.
So we have, since we've been doing this sort of together at the same time, we've talked a lot about the fact that we are women authors writing about women authors. And when I was rereading your book recently, I saw this quotation that you refer to from Eliot, wanting to write about, and this is the quoted part, the gradual action of ordinary causes rather than the exceptional, which to me feels like it comes from a culturally womanish place. I mean, I'm not going to put that well, but she wasn't trying to write about huge political events or the things that were traditionally the province of men. So I'm curious about what you saw, why that you referenced that, what you saw in Eliot, how it relates to your own work.
Right. No, I think it is an approach to writing that's more likely to come from a woman writer, particularly at that time. When you think about it, War and Peace was almost contemporaneous with this novel, with Middlemarch. And that's one of the things I just love about Eliot. It's one of the things that makes reading her so there's a gentleness and a rhythmicness, I feel like, to the experience of reading her, because it is about daily life. It is about it's very rooted in the material, in the everyday. And yet what I love about Eliot is she makes the everyday in the end so dramatic. She shows how high the stakes are, how high the emotional stakes are in everyday life. I mean, most obviously through the question of marriage and who you're going to marry, which is the question for a 19th century female, but also just through daily work, through sibling relationships, through parental-child relationships, through aging, through illness, through dying, anything we would talk about as sort of ordinary life. And that's what I think is so masterful about her. And I do feel like we found that commonality in the two books we addressed because, well, I mean, people today mostly know that Mrs. Dalloway was originally called The Hours. I mean, it's about the hourly progress of one day, in ordinary day in a city.
So it's interesting because, I mean, I think that Mrs. Dalloway is kind of transitional in this way, that it's about daily life or the hours, but it's also about a particular day. So there's a sense that it's a day of event. And there's this other character, Septimus Smith, this World War I veteran who suffers from what we would now call PTSD. And for him, obviously, it's a very momentous day. And I think one of the points that Woolf is trying to make is that because ordinary life takes place in the context of mortality and of our knowing about our own mortality, even the ordinary is always shadowed by the extraordinary. And I think that sense of Woolf's, of the presence of the end of life, of otherworldliness, of endless questioning of what is reality, what is life, what are we all doing here, takes her a little bit out of even saying there are such things as ordinary events. I think in a sense she's saying, none of this is ordinary, it's all extraordinary, which is a slightly different take. and more modernist. I mean, it's, you know, post World War I think people's thinking shifted, and this is explicitly a World War I novel.
Yeah. Yeah. There is that presence of war and the extraordinary in Mrs. Dalloway that really doesn't exist in Middlemarch. You have a general backdrop in Middlemarch of some political shifts, but there's not like a big war that's in the backdrop. There's not an earthquake. There's not, you know, it is different. And it does feel like Mrs. Dalloway comes out of a different time.
It's almost the inability, it illustrates the inability post World War I for British society to pick up the thread again and have ordinary unfoldings. Everything has been disrupted. Everything has been called into question, and people are left, you know, unable to live in that society. So I think the two books are super interesting in that way together, because you sort of see what Dalloway can't have anymore, in a sense, in the Eliot.
Yeah. And I've always found that so moving in Mrs. Dalloway, that the extraordinary character Septimus is folded into the daily life. We don't see him on the battlefield. We don't see him when his good friend dies. It's all, and to me that's more powerful. It's the aftermath.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. With the strong implication, I guess, that he is in some ways a stand-in for everybody. I mean, he has the specific and, you know, not replicable trauma of being in the war, but he is also the damaged society.
Yeah.
At the same time.
Well, this kind of leads to a related theme, I think, that we comes up in different ways in each book. There's, you know, the question of loneliness in both books, and maybe you could talk about that again in terms of how Mrs. Dalloway is portraying a society on a certain cusp, a certain shift, and how loneliness comes into that.
I think that there's definitely that sense of, you know, alienation as a kind of modern sense, and this being an early book that depicts, you know, in a sense, how people can't interact versus how they do interact. But on just sort of a more personal to Clarissa Dalloway herself level, I wrote this, you know, very serious book about this book. And toward the end of the process, I realized that I'd written very little about how I felt about Clarissa herself, which seemed odd. And I had this kind of backup of advice I wanted to give her if we were friends. So the final chapter of my book is a letter to Clarissa in a kind of like girlfriend to girlfriend way. And one of the things I realized I wanted to tell her, and do tell her in the letter, is you need some friends, Clarissa, because she is a very lonely figure at the center of a lot of hubbub of a household. And you know, one of the ways when my life was very much defined by my domestic existence, when I was home with my kids for 15 years, I had people I spoke to on the phone every day. We processed our lives together. We weren't alienated. And I think my initial sense was, well, yes, Septimus is very lonely because he's crushed by his experiences in the war. But Clarissa is also very lonely for reasons I don't really understand why Woolf did that. But she has also no support system. So in a sense, it is a book about people who are in a kind of lonely and removed setting. Everybody. There aren't a lot of scenes of people confiding in each other, really. Everyone, when there are scenes together, what you feel is the distance, not the communication. So, you know, how about Middlemarch? I mean, it's lonely within a community. How does that theme play out?
It's very different. And one of the things by the way, that letter that you end the book with is just like genius. And
Thank you.
I love it so much. It's so great. Middlemarch, again, I think it does have something to do with the different time periods the books were written in. And I talk in the book about how one reason I think I was and am so attracted to Middlemarch is that it does show. Middlemarch is the name of the town. It's the perfect title for the book because the book is really a portrait of a whole town, and everybody is interconnected. And as a kid growing up, a city kid in the 70s and 80s, growing up and really not having a lot of traditions or rituals or kind of not a lot of rootedness in a way, I think I'm super attracted to, and in some ways sometimes romanticize that kind of interconnectedness of a community. At the same time as it horrifies me, the idea of ever living in a community where everybody knew my business all the time, everybody knew what I was up to, who I was seeing, what I was doing. That's terrifying to me as someone who grew up in a city with that sort of wonderful anonymity that you have there. So I think it fascinates me, both pulls me and repels me. And I tried to talk about that in the book. In a way, loneliness is, there's no loneliness in Middlemarch because everybody has their duties to someone else. Everybody is known by someone else. And yet, if you dig a few layers down, there is a profound loneliness in especially the two main characters, Dorothea Brooke and Tertius Lydgate, who end up in marriages that are really misconceived. And I think George Eliot is brilliant at showing the loneliness that can exist within a marriage that's not a nurturing, thriving marriage. And what they each go through in very different ways is terrifying. And especially since at this time, you didn't get divorced. I mean, you didn't just say, hey, this was a big mistake, let's move on. You were there for, I mean, you could, and you married young, and you could just see the decades stretching ahead of like a dark tunnel. And George Eliot's really, really brilliant at showing that, as well as some of the loneliness of other characters who cannot marry for one reason or another, or are stuck in difficult family situations that they can't escape. So, but it's a very different kind of loneliness. It's not the loneliness really of sort of modern post-industrial.
Well, and there's another, I mean, you're reminding me that there's another aspect of loneliness in Mrs. Dalloway, which has to do with the utter taboo on same-sex romance. I mean, both of the main characters in the book, Septimus Smith and Clarissa Dalloway, have in their background a relationship with someone of their own gender. And in each case, that had to end. I mean, in the one case, it's war. And in the other case, it's really just this sort of societal, like, no, Clarissa, you must go with, with one of these men, as opposed to a woman. And I think that that strain of Clarissa being alienated from the happiness she felt with Sally Seton, her young companion, is another form of loneliness.
Yeah. And of course, Middlemarch doesn't go there at all.
And that's
not even a
hint.
Not a whisper. Not a whisper. I mean, in some ways it embarrasses me that this is the book so close to my heart, because it is so old fashioned. It's like, it's a sort of I have grappled with that also, like, to what degree is there a sort of fantasy for me of a very stable, sort of prelapsarian kind of, society. And, it's something to think about, because, it almost embarrasses me that I am so attracted to this world in which, as you're saying, there's certain questions that can't even be asked.
It's interesting because I didn't read Mrs. Dalloway till I was, as I said, in my 40s. And you read Middlemarch at 20 or so, I think 20. You said. I wonder what your response to it would be if you encountered it new now, or had at 40, whether those things would strike you more. And, at this point, it's an old friend to you. It's a long-term relationship. And, I have a question, which is, you spent a year with this book. Did anything about how you felt about it change? Did you discover, I mean, and it comes out of what you're saying there about, the discomfort with the sort of homogeneous society and the very strict societal taboos and all. But were there any other things where you thought, positive or negative, where you thought, oh, this is different?
Right. I think it's more been it's a more of an evolution than a sudden change. But this time through grappling with the book, I think I did ask myself more questions about my possible idealization of certain characters in the book. The characters I have loved my whole life. I've had crushes on my whole life. And I think I don't think that has ended, but I think I see darker shadows in some of those characters than I used to. And I think that's developed over time and really emerged for me with this latest reading. Dorothea Brooke is a character that's very divisive, actually. She's very saintly, and she's one of the best portraits in literature of an extreme empath, right? Someone who genuinely and naturally is very attuned to the suffering and needs of other people, which I find a beautiful thing. She really irritates some people who think, yeah, she's unreal or she's extreme. And while I can continue to appreciate her, I also see the sides of her that are just, a little beyond belief, we could say, that she's not really a creature who could live and breathe in the real world. She's close to it because George Eliot is a genius and she's in no way two-dimensional. She's very, very real. But to really be her would be almost impossible. And I've had to grapple with some of the ways in which I have demanded of myself on some level that kind of life, which I've never been able to achieve, of course, and have felt bad about it. And this last reading has maybe allowed me to let myself off the hook a little bit more. Now, I know you also have very complicated feelings about Clarissa. I mean, you've alluded to them a little bit in your letter, but I know there's more you could talk about.
I do have complicated feelings about her. I had an interesting experience while I was writing this. A very close friend and my mom, each having either never read the book or read it so long ago that they couldn't remember, picked it up and read it again so I could bounce ideas off them. And I won't speak for my mother because I've identified her, but I will say of this unidentified person that I don't think they much liked the book, and really responded to it in ways that, because I respect their intellect, their heart, their being, I went back into the book with it and could see ways in which Clarissa could be very frustrating, that, she wasn't everybody's cup of tea. And again, that letter I wrote to her at the end, I do suggest that she have friends. I also suggest she do something a little more worthwhile with her time. And I suggest that perhaps she get some help dealing with this death obsession of hers and this inability to stop thinking about a brief romance she had 40 years ago with this fellow. And so in a way, that letter was my space for venting some of my feelings that before, I think my earlier crush on the whole book and on the author of the book had kept me from being super critical in those ways. And from even looking at Clarissa as a full-blown character, which in some ways she's not. And in some ways she is a vehicle for Woolf's intellect and exploration of the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness. But there's enough of a woman there that you could have negative and positive responses. And I think she got under my skin more than she had in the past. And there were aspects of what Wolf did that I have struggled with. There's an experimental section called The Solitary Traveler. And for years, I felt guilty because I don't really know what it's about and I don't know why it's there. And I think trying to figure that out for over a year, I just decided, hey, Virginia, I think you could have made this a little clearer to me. So it was an evolving relationship, but a good one, a good relationship, but not entirely positive at every moment.
Yeah. We're talking a little bit about the difference between, we've alluded to crushes, our crush on the books and our crush on the authors, and kind of disentangling those. Because I have a super big crush on George Eliot. And at times I think I have had to disentangle that from the characters and see the characters as more complex and flawed than I originally had, and understand, more that my admiration is above all with the author.
Yeah.
Hey, Caroline.
Hi, I want to say this conversation is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. I have another question for you, but actually we have someone from the audience, Laura Tupper. Thank you, Laura. She said, thank you for this. I wonder which books Eliot and Wolf would have written about for the bookmark series. Any thought?
That's such a great
really
question.
interesting.
That's a great question.
Wolf might have written about Middlemarch.
What would she have said about it?
Oh boy, I'm never putting words in her mouth. I don't know. I mean, she did write some about Eliot and was a defender and a fan, I think, for the most part, right, Pamela?
She rescued Eliot from after Eliot died in 1880. Her stock, she had been incredibly famous and adored.
Infamous.
And her reputation took a nosedive, and she was seen as really old-fashioned. And an essay that Wolf wrote about her, I think in 1919 or something like that, really brought her back. And she was a big admirer of Middlemarch. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to say she would have preempted the preemption.
Yeah.
Which is not a preemption.
I also wanted to know, as writers, how did you both go about organizing your perceptions and your ideas about the books you were looking at? Did you just do a read through at first and then go back and try to take notes of what stopped you? How did you do that?
Well, I'm just going to say Pamela and I are friends and know of ourselves how very, very differently we work. And I'm going to put organized thoughts in quotes because she does, and I have trouble organizing thoughts. So I'll let her answer that.
Yeah. I'm still like the 10th grader. That's just so I read it through. I took quite a lot of notes, as I went. And I don't think a whole lot as I didn't think a whole lot as I read it. I was thinking. I mean, I wasn't thinking big thoughts. I was just reading through and taking notes about what struck me and sort of free associating. And when I'm done with all those notes, I read through my notes and I start to just mark the ones that leap out at me, and I forget about the ones that don't spark joy, so to speak. And then I winnow down the spark joy thoughts, and then I generally see that they fall into certain categories, which then I can organize. So it's this pretty methodical approach. And yes, Robin and I have talked about how we have very different approaches, and we sort of envy each other's approaches in some way.
Yeah, because I don't even have an approach. I mean, as anyone who's read any of my nonfiction knows, I have very serious ADD. And while I've gotten to a point in life where I actually can do things like write a book, the process is just, I think, unrecognizable to anybody. I mean, I stand up, I walk around, I say, this time I'm going to have index cards, I lose them, I get a whiteboard, I wrote on it 3 months before, I don't remember. I mean, even this morning I texted Pamela and said, there's something in the conversation we had about doing this. I can't read my own handwriting. And she reminded me of what the word was. So we do come at it from very different places. And for me, the real challenge was, and always is for me, writing anything remotely analytic, is organization. I have the ideas sputter, they come out, and then it's a question of corralling them into something that will be enjoyable and maybe even enlightening for someone else to read, as opposed to me just sort of going off on tangents. And it's reflected in the form of our books. Mine is really much more collage-like of essays, and Pamela's is, to me, really admirably makes sense as a book in some ways that I don't necessarily think mine does. But I think they complement each other really well.
They're both beautiful books. You have another question from Laurie Schaefer for both of you. Middlemarch is set in a time that was about 40 years in the past for George Eliot. Mrs. Dalloway is set more or less the time it was written. Can you comment on the consequences of those decisions for these books? And have any dilemmas like that come up for either of you in your own fiction?
Want to start, Robin?
Well, I'm just going to say there is what I call right now the 2015 problem for all writers, that we all talk about, which is when you are starting your new novel in 2022, do you write about the Trump years? Do you write about the pandemic? What do you do with the fact that the world and the result is that I have numerous friends who are writing novels set between 2012 and 2015 because they feel, as understandably, that those times were so dominant and changed how so many of us in this culture anyway related to the world, related to our sense of country, that they're just saying, well, that's not what I want to write about. So I'm going back in time. So I guess that's the long answer. And the short answer for Wolf is she really wanted to write about what was happening. And again, that goes to that sense of the difference between the ordinary unfolding of everyday events and event. And she was very focused still on World War I as the event. And I think that is different from Eliot and Middlemarch.
Eliot set many of her major works in the period of her own childhood. And I think it's because the sense memories of those times were so vivid for her. And she had such an incredible love for the landscape she grew up in and the communities that she grew up in. And you feel that love and that vividness. And I think that's why she does that. She was writing, she was writing more about ordinary life. And so I think the characters that she knew intimately from her youth, the examples of love, marriage, personal development, that's where she was able to really tap into.
I'll also just add, as I'm thinking this through about Woolf and Dalloway, Dalloway contains a lot of scathing social critique. So it's really inherent to the book that Woolf is writing about the time she lives in, because it is the time in which she herself experienced, the horrors of the mental health system. It is the time in which she saw the cannon fodder use of soldiers in World War I. So I think for her, it isn't just that it was the time around her, it was that she was making a point. It's a quite political book in its way.
Yeah.
So I have one more question, which is a question I always ask because I am an obsessive personality. What is haunting or obsessing each of you now? And do you think you'll write about it? I'm sorry. You can pass.
Well, what's so funny about this is Robin and I just had a conversation about something. I'm not going to name. I don't think we should name it, but we discovered some time ago that we both were obsessed with a certain historical figure when we were younger, and we've talked about this recently again. So who knows?
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, let me show these beautiful covers again. See? Whoops. It's always hard for me to get them in the right place. Okay. Middlemarch, Mrs. Dalloway, you can't do better than buy these two fascinating books, bookshop.org or your favorite indie. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to this absolutely extraordinary discussion. It's so funny because earlier we were talking about how high school ruined so much for us with favorite books. And I kept thinking, God, I wish I had heard this when I was in high school. It would have changed the way that I looked at books. So thank you so much, Robin. Thank you so much, Pamela.
Thank you so much, Caroline.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, Karen Belovich, for being such a fantastic producer and writer. And we'll see everybody next time. So thank you. Have a great day.